Now to introduce today's speakers. Our first speaker today is Dr. Jason Field, President and CEO of Life Sciences Ontario, the industry voice for the life sciences sector in Ontario. Since joining LSO in 2011, Jason has drawn on his extensive academic, professional, and government experience to build the life sciences sector in the province and across Canada. At LSO, Jason and his team are currently focused on the development and implementation of a provincial life sciences strategy. Our next speaker will be Brad Milson. Brad is Senior Principal of Real World Solutions at IQVIA. Brad leads projects to deliver market access strategy and real-world evidence-based solutions for the pharmaceutical industry and its stakeholders. He joined IQVIA in 2013, bringing his global expertise in pharmaceutical brand management, strong medical science training, and strategic problem-solving to the team. Brad has over 15 years of experience in the life sciences industry globally, across government and private sectors. In Canada, he's a recognized expert in health outcomes, market access, and policy strategy. I'll now hand it over to Jason.
Thank you, Diane. I wanted to give a bit of context before I hand it over to Brad to provide the data that IQVIA has been working on that we've commissioned. And this really goes back to cover how we wanted to measure the impacts of the federal government's new price controls for patented medicines in Canada. Earlier this year, we commissioned a survey of pharmaceutical and other life sciences leaders to see how they believe the PMPRB changes will impact their operations in Canada. What we found was that the respondents were unanimous in their conclusions around what these impacts would be, in particular, the negative impacts to new medicine launches in Canada. This is what companies told us, and this is what inspired us to investigate further. Meanwhile, the federal minister of health has continued to claim that many countries with lower prices have faster access to new medicines. Despite the changes in PMPRB, she believes that the medicine developers will continue to launch their products in Canada at the same rate that they do today. The federal government has provided no substantive analysis to support this position. As a science-based organization, LSO wanted to examine the data more carefully. So we commissioned IQVIA to look at launch trends in Canada and globally to see if they saw any trends in recent years. Unfortunately, as we'll find out from Brad in a moment, they were able to substantiate what we were told by the companies in that earlier survey. I'm going to stop there. I won't give away any more, and I'll hand it off to Brad to present the data.
Thanks very much, Jason. So as Diane mentioned, the presentation will kind of follow two formats. The first, I'll kind of give you the Coles Notes, everything you kind of need to know and the key takeaways from this analysis, hopefully within 5 to 8 minutes. If you're crunched for time. Following that, I'll actually then go into much more detail around the analysis, what we did, and the conclusions we came to. So I do hope you enjoy and find it informative. In terms of the analysis, really it was about answering two key questions. Obviously, in light of the proposed policy reforms, Life Sciences Ontario wanted to know the impact that it may have in terms of new launches in Canada. So we asked two key questions. First is, how does Canada compare against international markets in terms of time to launch, proportion of launches, and sequence in launch for new medicines? And then the second key question was, have we seen any changes in the recent history? And that's what we'll show you today. So in terms of how we did the analysis, we drew upon our MIDAS IQVIA database. IQVIA MIDAS database is the world's largest and most comprehensive source of pharmaceutical data and information globally. It covers 93 countries across the globe and a myriad of distribution channels. It really is the gold standard for us to understand where drugs are being launched, when they are being launched, and how many. In terms of the methodology, just very briefly, we looked at the last 20 years of sales data within Midas, looking at the top 25 countries globally. And we looked for new active substances. These are brand new drugs that have launched and have never been launched before. And the key metric that we were looking for here is that launch date. And we looked at the launch date across all these countries. So from which country launched first and the date that that launched, and then every subsequent country after that, and how long it took for each subsequent country to launch. The key metrics that we examined in this were time to launch. And so time to launch was that metric of from that first global launch to when it launched in a particular country. And that's what I mean by time to launch. Proportion is obviously how many drugs a particular company or country launched in terms of the overall global basket. And then we also looked at recent trends in terms of how these two metrics have changed over time. And right into the data, the first thing we wanted to look at was what is that time to launch? And what we saw was Canada actually was fourth to launch new active substances or new medicines, just behind the US, Germany, and UK, with a median time of 1.2 years from first global launch to launch in Canada. And this is over the 20-year period. In terms of proportion of drug launches, Canada received about 66% of all new drug launches globally, compared to 89% for the US, which was the gold standard. This put Canada ranked around 9th in the same region as other Western European countries, such as Belgium and Switzerland, as well as slightly ahead of Japan. Now, let's look at this from both of those metrics, and it gives us a chance to really see where Canada is in terms of groupings or tiers with other countries. So on the left-hand axis, you have the proportion of drugs launched, and on the right, you have that time lag, that median time. You can see a few trends here. First is US, Germany, and UK. These are your first to launch countries. They tend to launch first, and they tend to also have a very high proportion of new launches. There's a few common characteristics of these three countries that we noted. First is they all three have unrestricted list prices at launch. They're also very large and some of the largest markets in the world. And they also have a high level of regulatory certainty in those launches. Next, we look at where Canada landed. And Canada actually came very close to Switzerland. And if you compare Canada to Switzerland, there's actually a lot of common and unique aspects. First, they have fairly harmonized but independent regulatory agencies. They both have robust private insurance markets beyond the public market. And they both have relatively high list prices. Last, we wanted to see, what's on the other end of the spectrum. So if we look at the last country on our list, we have China. China is actually one of the largest global markets. It's currently #2 in terms of size of the market, but it is also often associated with historically complex and unpredictable regulatory environment, which may have had an impact why it appeared so much later in the graph. So that gives you a very high-level view of where Canada stands in terms of launch tiering or launch priority. Next, we wanted to look at was how has this changed over time, and can we see trends? So first, we looked at that time to launch and actually Canada's rank amongst launches over time. And what we saw over the last around decade and a half, is that Canada's tier or status within time to launch has actually gradually improved. On the bar, we have the median time to launch, and in the green, we actually have Canada's rank, so where it was positioned relative to others in terms of launches of that year. And what we can see is the time has gradually improved, but also the rank has gone from about 8th or 9th at the beginning of our period to third and fourth in the last few years. So Canada's rank has been improving. Next we wanted to look at, though, was, well, how many launches are happening in Canada? And so here we have the number of new launches every year since 2005. And what we have seen is a trend increasing over the last 15 years, with Canada receiving more and more new launches every year, with the exception of 2019. We actually see a fall off in launches to the lowest number of new launches that we see in our analysis period of 13 in 2019. So then the question becomes, well, perhaps that is a global slowdown in productivity. So next we wanted to compare that against what we're seeing globally. And so here we have that trend line in green of global new launches. And you can see a gradual increase, but you don't quite see a drop off in the last few years. But as we had discussed earlier, there is actually a lag between when Canada receives launches and when there are, first global launches. So really roughly about a 1.5 to 2 year lag. So we wanted to compensate for that and try and compare apples to apples in terms of when how many global launches we see and how many launches we would expect Canada to see. So we actually shifted that curve over by 2 years. And what you can actually see when you do that is you actually see a much more common trend between the two curves. You can see that relationship between the global launches and the Canadian launch. And that's where it becomes a little bit more clear to us that there might have been something going on in 2019. We see that sharp drop off in Canada, but we would have expected to see an increase in that year. There's not many years where we see a deviation between what we see globally and what we see in Canada, and never to this magnitude. So it really begs the question, what might be going on in 2019? The last thing we did was we looked at, well, what's missing? What are those drugs that have not launched? And we'll go into in more detail, but at a very high level, there's some quite interesting products. Most, or at least the majority, were actually in oncology and rare diseases, but you'll see that there's an array of drugs across the spectrum of disease areas that have not launched in Canada, but have launched globally. So to summarize, the key takeaways from this analysis. First is we do see evidence that Canada is a top-tier market and shares a launch place amongst the top countries globally. And that position has actually improved over time in terms of time to launch and sequence in the launch. However, in 2019, we did see early signs of change with a significant drop in new launches in 2019, directly opposite of what we saw in global trends. And that really concludes our executive level summary.